Hi, I'm Daniel. I watched a room full of millionaires, led by the billionaire owner himself, laugh at my 12-year-old brother Leo, just moments before he fixed their priceless, unfixable Lamborghini Revuelto. They saw a kid with grease under his fingernails and dismissed him. But that grease was the key to saving them from total humiliation. It's amazing how quickly a rich man's pride can shatter when faced with a problem his money can't solve. Have you ever been completely invisible, even when you knew you held the only answer that mattered? Before I tell you about the dead silence that fell over that polished concrete showroom when the V12 engine roared back to life, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and make sure you subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on that billionaire's face when he realized his entire ego was just rescued by the caterer's kid he'd mocked just minutes earlier. It was a sight I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, and a lesson for everyone in that room. The event was held in the private showroom of a tech mogul named Mr. Harrison. It was less a garage and more a sterile temple to wealth, all polished concrete, steel beams and glass walls. His car collection was legendary, but tonight was about one thing: his brand new one-of-a-kind Lamborghini Revuelto. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and smug satisfaction. My dad was the head caterer, and he'd brought me and Leo along to help serve. We were supposed to be background noise, just part of the scenery. But then the main event started, and the multi-million-dollar centerpiece of the evening refused to start. The failure wasn't just a small glitch. It was a catastrophic silence. Mr. Harrison, with his biggest business rivals watching, slid into the driver's seat, a triumphant grin on his face. He pressed the start button. A pathetic whir, a flicker of the dashboard, and then nothing. Just the humiliating sound of silence echoing in. A room built for roars. You could feel the mood shift instantly from celebration to a kind of predatory glee among the guests. They weren't just watching a car fail. They were watching Mr. Harrison's perfect image crumble in real time, and they were savoring every second of it. He tried again, and again. His smile tightened, then vanished completely. He got out of the car, his face a mask of controlled fury, and gestured sharply to a team of elite Lamborghini technicians he'd flown in from Germany just for this. Their leader, a tall, arrogant man named Klaus, immediately descended on the car with laptops and diagnostic tools. They barked at each other in German, plugging cables into the car, their faces growing more and more concerned. The guests began to whisper, their polite smiles turning into unconcealed smirks. The air grew heavy with schadenfreude, the German word for finding joy in someone else's misfortune. It was a word I learned that night. While all this drama unfolded, my brother Leo was standing silently in a corner near the catering station, almost completely hidden behind a stack of trays. He wasn't watching the people. He was watching the car. He wasn't looking at it. He was listening to it, his head tilted slightly. I saw him close his eyes, completely lost in a world of his own. I knew that look. It was the same one he'd get in our dad's old garage, back when we still had it, right before he'd pinpoint a problem in an engine that had stumped my father. For days. He was a strange kid, my brother. He didn't just hear machines, he felt them. He finally moved, a small, almost imperceptible shift from his corner. He walked over to my dad, who was nervously rearranging a tray of untouched canapes, and whispered something in his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the effect they had. My dad's face went pale. It wasn't disbelief, it was fear. A deep, primal fear of a man who knows his place and sees his son about to step far, far out of it. He grabbed Leo's arm, his grip tight. "Leo, no, not here. These aren't our people," he hissed, his voice trembling. He was trying to protect him, to shove him back into the invisibility that kept us safe in places like this. But Leo just stood there, his eyes still fixed on the silent, multi-million-dollar failure in the center of the room. Leo gently pulled his arm free from my dad's grasp. He wasn't being defiant, just incredibly focused, as if the rest of the room had faded into a dull hum. He looked at my dad, his expression one of profound seriousness. "It's not the software, Dad," he said, his voice quiet but firm enough for me to hear this time. "It's the power converter. It's starving for a clean ground. I can feel it vibrating wrong just before it cuts out." He used the word feel like other people use the word see. For him, the car wasn't just a machine of metal and wires. It was a living thing with a pulse, and its rhythm was off. My dad just shook his head, his eyes pleading with his son to just let it go, to not draw the kind of attention that could get us all thrown out. Of course, it was too late. Klaus, the lead German technician, had the sharp ears of a predator. He spun around, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain. He didn't even look at Leo. He directed his condescending glare straight at my father. "Can you please control your child?" he snapped, his German accent thick with irritation. "This is a highly complex diagnostic procedure, not a schoolyard for him to play in." The insult was a double-edged sword, hitting not just Leo's credibility but my dad's authority as a parent. I saw my dad flinch, as if he'd been struck. In that single sentence, Klaus had reduced us from service staff to a nuisance, a messy problem to be cleaned up and put away. That's when the whispers in the room changed. Before, they were focused on Mr. Harrison's misfortune. Now they were directed at us. The amusement had found a new, more satisfying target. A few guests started pointing discreetly. Their lips curled into smug smiles. The failure of a hypercar was abstract, but the sight of a greasy-handed kid in a cheap polo shirt thinking he knew better than a team of world-class engineers, that was a spectacle. It was a joke they could all understand and enjoy. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. We were no longer invisible. We were the evening's entertainment, and the feeling of all those wealthy, judging eyes on us was suffocating. Mr. Harrison finally noticed the commotion. His face, already tight with frustration, twisted into a scowl as he marched over to our corner. "What is going on here?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. My dad began to stammer an apology, trying to physically shield Leo from the billionaire's wrath. But my brother, all 4'10" of him, stepped out from behind our dad. He looked straight up into Mr. Harrison's furious eyes, completely unafraid, and repeated his diagnosis, his voice ringing, with a strange, calm authority. "Sir, your technicians are looking at the code. The problem isn't in the code. It's a faulty ground on the high-voltage power inverter. It's creating a micro-vibration that's tripping the safety sensors." For a split second, there was dead silence. The sheer audacity of it hung in the air. Then one of Harrison's rivals, a man in a ridiculously expensive-looking silk jacket, let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. That one laugh was all it took. It was like a dam, breaking. The room filled with a wave of condescending chuckles and patronizing smirks. Klaus, the engineer, threw his head back and laughed out loud, a harsh, ugly sound. "A micro-vibration," he scoffed, turning to his colleagues. "The boy has been watching too many cartoons." The humiliation was complete and absolute. They weren't just dismissing him, they were mocking him, turning his insight into a punchline for their own amusement. I felt my fists clench at my sides, a wave of useless anger washing over me. Mr. Harrison looked from his smirking guests to his arrogant technicians, and then down at my brother, who hadn't flinched. The fury in his eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Utter bottom-of-the-barrel desperation. He had been publicly shamed all evening. His car was dead, his experts were useless, and his rivals were loving every second of it. What more did he have to lose? He threw his hands up in a gesture of theatrical defeat. "Fine," he boomed, his voice dripping with a bitter, biting sarcasm that silenced the room. "The so-called experts are getting us nowhere. Let's see what the caterer's boy can do. Give him a shot." It wasn't an offer. It was a challenge, a public execution. He was putting my 12-year-old brother on stage, expecting him to fail, to provide one final pathetic laugh for his guests before the night was officially declared a disaster. Klaus let out a short, incredulous laugh, but my dad didn't. I saw the blood drain from his face. This was his worst nightmare realized. In our world, you don't challenge men like Mr. Harrison. You don't make a scene. You do your job, you stay invisible, and you go home. My dad grabbed Leo's shoulder again, a desperate, silent plea. But Leo just shrugged it off, his eyes never leaving the car. He looked small and out of place under the harsh showroom lights, a little boy in a cheap shirt about to play with a rich man's multi-million-dollar toy. The silence in the room was no longer just awkward, it was predatory. Everyone was waiting for the punchline, for the kid to fall flat on his face and confirm what they all believed, that some people are just born to be better than others. Leo didn't even seem to notice them. He took a deep breath like a diver about to go under and walked toward the Lamborghini. He didn't look at the engine, not at first. He just walked a slow, deliberate circle around the car. Then he stopped, and turned to the stunned crowd. "I need it to be completely quiet, please," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange quality of command that cut through the low murmurs. For a second, nobody moved. Then Mr. Harrison, his face a bizarre mask of sarcasm and genuine curiosity, shot a death glare at his guests. "You heard the boy, shut up." The whispers died instantly. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's climate control system. It was the most surreal moment of my life. He didn't open the engine bay. He didn't ask for a tool. He just closed his eyes. I knew what he was doing. He was shutting out the people, the lights, the pressure, and he was focusing on the one thing in the room that made sense to him, the machine. He was listening for its rhythm, for the tiny inconsistency that only he could perceive. To the guests, it must have looked like some kind of bizarre performance art. I saw Klaus, the German engineer, whisper something to his colleague, and they both shared a look of utter contempt. They saw a child playing make-believe, but I saw a master craftsman assessing his work. He was in his element, even if that element was a billionaire's sterile showroom surrounded by people who wanted him to fail. Then he moved. He walked to the rear of the car and placed his small, grease-stained hands flat against the carbon fiber panel, right above the passenger side rear wheel. He stood there, perfectly still, for what felt like an eternity, his brow furrowed in concentration. It reminded me of something our grandfather, a watchmaker, once told him. He said that the most complex machines are like orchestras. If one tiny screw is tightened too much, it creates a dissonant vibration that throws the entire performance off. You can't see it. You have to feel it. At that moment, Leo wasn't a caterer's kid. He was our grandfather's grandson, a boy who understood the secret language of gears and circuits, of tension and harmony. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open. He didn't look triumphant or excited. He just looked certain. He dropped his hands and pointed to a spot deep inside the visible part of the engine bay, near a cluster of bright orange high-voltage cables. "There," he said, his voice clear and steady. "It's the main grounding bolt for the DC to AC power inverter." He looked directly at Klaus, the engineer. "You're all looking for a software fault or a loose connection. It's not loose." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "It's too tight. It's creating a harmonic resonance that's tripping the primary safety sensor." The statement was so specific, so utterly counterintuitive, that it just hung there, baffling everyone. Too tight? How could something be too tight? Klaus exploded. It wasn't a shout, but a sharp, derisive burst of laughter that was far more insulting. "Too tight? Preposterous," he spat, his professional pride wounded to the core. "These bolts are torqued by machine at the factory to precise specifications. It is a fixed value. The boy is inventing fantasies." He turned to Mr. Harrison, his face red with indignation, trying to reclaim his authority. "Sir, this is an embarrassment. We are wasting valuable time on this circus." Some of the guests nodded in agreement, their brief curiosity turning back into smug certainty. The expert had spoken. The fantasy was over. The kid was just a kid, after all. The brief moment of possibility collapsed back into the cold reality of the room. But Mr. Harrison didn't look at Klaus. His eyes were locked on my brother. Leo hadn't moved. He didn't argue or try to defend himself. He just stood there, his gaze unwavering, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He had stated a fact, and in his mind, there was nothing left to debate. Harrison looked from the furious, sputtering German engineer to the calm, silent 12-year-old boy. He'd been humiliated all night. His experts had failed. His rivals were laughing at him. What was one more risk? He made his decision. He pointed a single trembling finger, not at my brother, but at Klaus. "Give him the wrench," he commanded, his voice low and deadly serious. "Now." The silence that followed Harrison's command was heavier than anything I had ever felt. It was thick with disbelief, anger, and a sick sense of anticipation. Klaus, the lead engineer, stood frozen for a moment, his face a battleground of professional pride and raw fury. Being ordered around by a billionaire was one thing. Being forced to hand over his tools to a child in front of this audience was a humiliation of a different order entirely. His hand, holding a state-of-the-art digital torque wrench, trembled slightly. He looked at Mr. Harrison, then at Leo, and for a second, I thought he might refuse. But Harrison's gaze was like granite. Slowly, reluctantly, as if the tool weighed 1,000 pounds, Klaus extended the wrench towards my brother. The transfer was a symbolic surrender, a world-class expert defeated by a 12-year-old's impossible theory. Leo took the wrench without a word. He didn't snatch it or show any sign of triumph. He accepted it with a quiet, solemn gravity, his small hands closing around the textured grip. He held it for a moment, not like a toy, but like an extension of his own arm. He turned it over, his eyes scanning the digital display and the settings with a familiarity that was deeply unsettling to the technicians watching. He pressed a button, and a small beep echoed in the silent room as he adjusted the torque setting. It wasn't a guess, it was a precise calculation. Klaus watched, his mouth a thin white line of rage. He had been rendered a mere assistant, a tool caddy for the caterer's boy. In that moment, the power dynamic of the entire room had been completely inverted, balanced on the small shoulders of my brother. With the wrench in hand, Leo turned and walked back toward the silent Lamborghini. Every single eye in that showroom followed his small frame. The sound of his worn-out sneakers on the polished concrete floor seemed deafeningly loud. I could feel my own heart pounding against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of hope and terror. I wanted so badly for him to be right, to wipe the smug looks off every face in that room, but I was also terrified of what would happen if he was wrong. The fall would be immense. My dad stood frozen by the catering table, his face ashen, looking like a man watching his son walk a tightrope over a canyon. The air was electric with tension, a collective breath held in 100 wealthy chests, all waiting for the show to reach its inevitable, disastrous conclusion. He didn't hesitate. Reaching the rear of the car, he leaned over the gleaming, sculpted bodywork, his cheap polo shirt brushing against a machine worth more than our entire neighborhood. He was careful, his movements economical and precise, showing a respect for the machine that the technicians, with all their bluster, had lacked. He reached deep into the engine bay, his arm disappearing into the labyrinth of wires and polished metal, aiming for that one specific spot he had pointed to earlier. It was an awkward angle, forcing him to balance on his toes. For a moment, I saw him struggle to get the right purchase on the bolt, which was almost completely obscured by a thick bundle of orange high-voltage cabling. The room was so quiet, you could hear the soft whir of the wrench's internal electronics. Then came the sound. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dramatic crack or a satisfying thud. It was just a small anticlimactic click, the sound of the torque wrench reaching its preset value, a tiny, almost insignificant noise in the grand, silent theater of the showroom. Leo had turned the bolt maybe a quarter of a turn, nothing more. A minuscule adjustment on a single hidden bolt. He held it there for a second, then smoothly withdrew the wrench and his arm from the engine bay. He didn't inspect his work or look for any confirmation. He just knew. The entire action had taken less than 30 seconds, a brief, focused burst of activity that felt both impossibly quick and agonizingly slow. The fate of the evening, of Mr. Harrison's pride and my brother's credibility, rested on that single, quiet click. Leo stepped back from the car, his face completely neutral. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look proud or relieved. He just looked like a craftsman who had finished a job. He walked back towards Klaus, holding out the expensive wrench. The German engineer just stared at it, dumbfounded, as if it were a venomous snake. Leo simply placed it on a nearby tool cart when Klaus didn't take it. Then he turned, not to the crowd, but to Mr. Harrison, who had watched the entire sequence without breathing. Leo gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Try it now," he said, his voice calm and even, cutting through the suffocating silence. It wasn't a request or a suggestion. It was a simple statement of fact, a quiet instruction from the only person in the room who truly understood what had just happened. The entire room seemed to pivot, all attention snapping from my brother to Mr. Harrison. The billionaire stood frozen for a beat, his expression a chaotic mix of shock, skepticism, and a desperate, flickering ember of hope. He looked at the team of stunned German engineers, at his smirking rivals, and then back at the small, grease-stained boy standing calmly in the middle of his showroom floor. You could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Was this real? Or was it the final, cruel joke in a night full of them? Slowly, as if moving through water, he began to walk toward the driver's side door of the Revuelto. Every step he took amplified the tension. This was it, the moment of truth. My dad was muttering a quiet prayer under his breath, I just held mine, waiting for the roar or for the silence to crush us all. Mr. Harrison got into the driver's seat, the leather sighing under his weight. He didn't look at anyone, but I could see his hand tremble slightly as he reached for the start button. The entire room held its breath. It was a thick, heavy silence, the kind that precedes an execution. All the smirks had frozen on the faces of his guests, replaced by a raw, predatory curiosity. They were still expecting failure, but now there was a sliver of doubt, a tiny crack in their certainty that made the moment unbearable. My dad had his hands clasped together so tightly, his knuckles were white. He was looking at Leo, not the car, as if trying to shield him from the inevitable disappointment with his gaze alone. The weight of every single person's expectation, ridicule, and disbelief was focused on that one red button on the center console. He pressed it. For a split second, there was nothing but the familiar, pathetic whir. A collective, silent, "I told you so," seemed to sweep through the room. But then it happened. It wasn't just a start. It was a detonation. The V12 engine didn't just turn over. It erupted with a ferocious, clean, and deafening roar that shook the very glass walls of the showroom. It was the sound of pure, untamed power, perfectly synchronized with the high-pitched, futuristic hum of the electric motors kicking in flawlessly. The sound wasn't just loud, it was perfect. It was the sound of a $1 million machine coming to life exactly as its creators intended. It filled every inch of the sterile space with a visceral, violent life, a primal scream of mechanical perfection that blasted away all the silence and doubt that had poisoned the air for hours. The roar echoed, and then settled into a deep, menacing purr, and in its wake, a new kind of silence fell over the room. Not the silence of tension, but the silence of absolute jaw-dropping shock. The man in the silk jacket, the one who had laughed the loudest, just stood there, his mouth hanging open, a half-eaten shrimp puff forgotten in his hand. Every single smirk had vanished, replaced by identical masks of stunned disbelief. They looked from the purring hypercar to my small, unassuming brother and back again. The mental gymnastics were almost visible on their faces as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The world-class experts had failed. The diagnostic computers had failed. But the greasy-handed caterer's kid, with a single quiet click of a wrench, had succeeded. The joke was over, and they weren't in on the punchline. I glanced over at Klaus and his team of technicians. If the guests were shocked, the engineers were annihilated. Klaus's face was a pale, bloodless mask. His professional arrogance had been utterly and publicly dismantled. He stared at the car, then at his useless, multi-thousand-dollar diagnostic tablet lying on the tool cart, as if seeing it for the first time. It was no longer a symbol of his expertise, but a monument to his failure. I could see the gears turning in his head, the logic of his entire world crumbling. How could a precise, factory-torqued bolt be the problem? How could the solution be more torque, not less? It defied every page of the manuals he had memorized, every certification he had earned. He wasn't just wrong, he had been proven irrelevant by a child. Mr. Harrison switched off the engine, and the sudden return to silence was almost as shocking as the roar had been. He got out of the car, but he didn't look triumphant. He didn't even glance at his rivals. He looked humbled. He looked like a man who had just been given a profound lesson, one that had shaken him to his core. He walked slowly, deliberately, not towards his guests to gloat, but straight past his team of shell-shocked German engineers, ignoring them as if they were part of the furniture. His eyes, now clear of frustration and filled with a strange kind of awe, were locked on one person and one person only, my 12-year-old brother Leo, who was still standing calmly in the middle of the floor as if he'd just finished a simple math problem. He stopped in front of Leo, the billionaire tycoon towering over the small boy in the cheap polo shirt. The contrast was almost comical, but no one was laughing now. Harrison placed a hand on my brother's shoulder, a gesture of profound, unstated respect. He then turned his gaze to my dad, who looked like he might faint. "Your son," Harrison said, his voice quiet, but carrying across the silent room, "is a genius. He didn't offer money. He offered something infinitely more valuable. I want to fund the reopening of your auto shop, whatever it costs, and I want to create a new division for special diagnostics, a lab, for him." He looked back down at Leo. "You will have anything you need, the best tools, any car you want to study. Consider it a permanent consulting contract. Then Harrison did something I will never forget. He kept his hand on Leo's shoulder and turned to face his chief rival, the man in the silk jacket who was still looking utterly bewildered. Harrison's voice was firm, not with arrogance but with the weight of a newly learned truth. "Tonight we all learned something," he said, his words a final judgment on the evening's events. "We learned that real genius isn't measured by a diploma or the price of your suit. It's measured by the ability to listen to things no one else can hear." He paused, letting the words sink in, and that sometimes the most valuable things in this world are found in the most unexpected and most overlooked of places. The silence that followed was one of deep, humbling respect. My dad didn't answer Mr. Harrison right away. He just stood there, his face a mess of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. I saw the shock, of course, but underneath it was the shadow of years of hard work, of losing his first shop, of the quiet shame he carried thinking he had failed us. And now, this, a second chance, a dream he had long since buried, being handed back to him, not because of his own hard work, but because of his son's strange, inexplicable gift. He looked at Leo, and for the first time that night I saw the fear in his eyes completely replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated awe. Tears welled up as he finally understood that the very thing he'd tried to protect Leo from was the one thing that would save them all. He simply nodded, unable to speak, a lifetime of unspoken pride and love passing between him and his son. The atmosphere among the guests had undergone a seismic shift. The smug amusement and condescending whispers had evaporated, replaced by a thick, palpable sense of wonder. People were no longer looking at us as the hired help. They were looking at Leo like he was some kind of magician. Harrison's main rival, the man in the silk jacket, walked over. He didn't say a word to Harrison. He walked right up to my dad, extended his hand and said, "You have a remarkable son." It wasn't flattery. It was a concession, a statement of respect from one powerful man to another, though my dad had never felt powerful a day in his life. The power in the room had been rebalanced. It no longer belonged to the men with the biggest bank accounts, but to the small boy who could hear the secrets that machines whispered. In the corner, Klaus and his team of expert technicians were packing their equipment with a quiet, defeated haste. They moved like ghosts, their earlier arrogance completely stripped away, leaving only a raw, visible humiliation. Klaus didn't make eye contact with anyone. He couldn't look at the car, he couldn't look at Harrison, and he certainly couldn't look at Leo. His entire world, built on certifications, precision instruments, and factory protocols, had been dismantled by a child's intuition and a quarter turn of a wrench. There were no excuses to be made, no technical jargon to hide behind. They had been flown across the world to be the best, and they had been proven utterly, undeniably wrong in the most public way imaginable. They slipped out a side door, their silence a far more damning confession than any apology could ever be. The weeks that followed were a blur of surreal activity. Mr. Harrison wasn't just making an offer, he was executing a plan. Lawyers called, architects sent blueprints. We walked through the dusty shell of my dad's old garage, a place of ghosts and failed dreams, but this time we weren't there to mourn. We were there to build. My dad, holding a set of plans for a facility that looked more like a Formula One workshop than a neighborhood garage, was a different man. The weight was gone from his shoulders, and Leo was in his element. He spent his days not in front of a video game, but hunched over complex wiring diagrams, sketching out ideas for his diagnostics lab with a focus that was both thrilling and a little terrifying. He was finally free to be exactly who he was. True to his word, Harrison established the Leo Vance STEM Scholarship for Intuitive Engineering. It wasn't just for straight-A students, but for kids like Leo, the ones who took things apart, who learned by doing, whose genius didn't fit neatly into a report card. The story of that night was never blasted on the news. Harrison was too private for that, but it became a legend, a whispered tale in the exclusive world of hypercar collectors and high-finance boardrooms. It was a story about a billionaire's broken toy and the caterer's kid who fixed it. It served as a quiet, potent reminder that sometimes the most valuable insights don't come from the top of the ladder, but from the bottom rung, from the people you're trained not to see. A year later, I stood at the grand opening of Vance & Son Advanced Diagnostics, The place gleamed. It was a temple of clean steel, bright lights, and technology I didn't have words for. In the center bay on a hydraulic lift sat the Lamborghini Revuelto, a permanent gift from Harrison for continued research. My dad stood beside me, his arm around my shoulder. He wasn't the tired, anxious man I remembered. He was confident, happy, and whole again. He watched Leo, who was explaining a complex diagnostic reading on a massive monitor to a visiting engineer from another car company. My dad smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "You know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent my whole life listening to engines. But your brother, he hears them sing. If you know someone who needs to hear this message of self-belief, please share this video with them. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength, especially when the world tries to tell you you have none." Thank you for listening. The opening of Vance & Son Advanced Diagnostics wasn't just about a new business. It was like watching a ghost come back to life. The old garage had been a place of shadows and failure, a monument to my dad's biggest regret. This new place, gleaming under bright LED lights, was the opposite. It was a testament to the fact that his son's strange gift, something he once feared, was actually their salvation. The first time we all walked in, the smell wasn't of old oil and disappointment, but of fresh paint, new beginnings, and limitless potential. My dad ran his hand over a brand new workbench, the same way he used to touch the old scarred one. But this time his eyes weren't filled with nostalgia or sadness. They were filled with a profound, quiet gratitude for the son who saw the world in a way he never could. Leo didn't change. Not really. He was still the same quiet, intense kid with grease under his fingernails. What changed was the world around him. He was no longer the weird kid in the corner. He was a consultant. The lab Harrison built for him became his kingdom. Engineers from major car companies would fly in, not to instruct but to listen, to watch this teenager diagnose problems their most advanced systems couldn't flag. The Leo Vance STEM scholarship became his real legacy. It wasn't for the kids with perfect grades. It was for the tinkerers, the dreamers, the ones who learned with their hands and their hearts. It was for the kids who, like Leo, were told they were just playing games when they were actually on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. He was giving a voice to all the other quiet geniuses. That Lamborghini Revuelto, the car that had been the source of so much humiliation, became a permanent fixture in our shop. It sat on a special lift in the center of the main bay, not as a trophy, but as a research subject. Harrison would visit sometimes, not with the swagger of a billionaire owner, but with the quiet reverence of a student. He'd stand for an hour, just watching Leo work, listening to him explain the intricate dance of electrons and vibrations. The car was no longer a symbol of his power, but a constant million-dollar reminder of his own short-sightedness, and of the night his entire world-view was taken apart and put back together by a 12-year-old boy. It was his penance and his pride all at once. It taught him and all of us that true value is rarely what's printed on the price tag. That night in the showroom, we all learned a lesson that went far beyond cars and engines. We learned that expertise isn't always loud. It doesn't always wear an expensive suit or carry a fancy degree. Sometimes the most profound knowledge is quiet, intuitive, and hidden in plain sight. It lives in the hands of a craftsman, the eyes of an artist, or the ears of a boy who can hear the tiny, dissonant note in a world full of noise. We're all taught to trust the experts, the authorities, the ones with the official credentials. But the real breakthroughs, the real moments of magic, often come from the people we're trained to ignore. The world is full of whispers, full of secrets waiting to be heard, if only we have the humility to stop talking and finally listen. If you know someone who feels overlooked, someone whose unique talent isn't being seen, please share this story with them. It's a reminder that their voice matters even if it's quiet. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own strength and trusting that quiet voice inside, especially when the world is telling you to be silent. Thank you for being here and for listening to our story. It means more than you know.